Hello, everybody. If it looks as if I'm sitting here with my mouth open, unsure of whether or not I should be speaking, it's because I'm not sure of whether or not I should be speaking. Partly because I'm just not sure, but definitely because we still have lots of people entering the room. So why don't we give it another couple of minutes until all of the people who want to enter the room have entered the room, and then we'll start. Is that okay? In fact, it looks like they could be forever entering the room. So why don't I introduce myself and hey, we've got two hosts tonight. Hello, Helen.
Hey, hi, Michael.
How
Hi.
are you doing?
I'm really excited about tonight. Yeah, really excited.
Okay, it's very, very strange, Helen, to be kind of co-hosting with somebody who's somewhere else in another room. Where are you? Are you in England?
Yes, it's an international book launch, but yeah, I'm here in London, England.
Oh, okay. So you're in South or North London?
I'm a North London girl.
Oh, okay, okay. Well, I'm in South East London. Yeah, but I'm really looking forward to tonight. It's an amazing book, isn't it?
Yeah, I've got mine right here.
Have you got yours right there?
Yeah. right here, and I've managed to read it all, and yeah, I'm absolutely blown away by it. Amazing work by all the authors, and a really important, timely book for the time that we're in now. So yeah.
It really is definitely that, isn't it? It couldn't have come out at a better time. But when we were talking, when you and I were talking earlier on today and kind of planning how we were going to be this evening, something that you said that really struck me was that we've just got all of these Black professors and people who have been doing all of this thinking, and it's so good to have them all in one place to kind of listen to their ideas. And I must admit, I haven't got all the way through the book, but the things that I've read are kind of it's just been amazing, you know. And I feel as if I've been kind of working in this field for hundreds of years, but there's just always so much to learn.
Yeah,
Shall
and I
we,
think sorry, Michael, just to say, I think it's important to say that, you know, we've got Black mental health practitioners and other, you know, Black people who specialised in their field who've got some really important things to say. And, you know, it's great that, you know, we've got this platform tonight to kind of showcase them and their work. Yeah.
Yeah, and the book gives us something different to reference. We've got somewhere to reference back. I'm just thinking about kind of all of the work I've done with Black boys in schools, and it would have been so good to have this to reference back, to know that there were people out there that kind of understood the situation, that understood where we are from a kind of similar perspective as mine, and certainly from people with a kind of similar experience to mine. I mean, it's...
Yeah. No, I totally agree. And I think what's special about this book, it comes with solutions.
Yeah, that it's not just kind of laying problems out, because in a way that's kind of simple to do, to identify what the problem is. But in this book, they have some amazing kind of solutions and give you some really clear kind of roads to kind of follow in doing this work. I mean, it is an amazing piece. But listen, shall we hear from Jenny McCall? No, let's not. Is it Jenny McCall that we're going to hear from first?
Yep, senior publisher, science.
Yeah, I think I'm first up.
Are you first up, Jenny? How are you doing?
I'm all right, thank you. It's just such a pleasure to be here and be part of this. Yeah, I'm just thrilled to be attending the launch. This is one of the most important books we'll publish this year. And I know the culmination of huge efforts, a commitment by the volume's 3 editors and all the contributors. And I just wanted to congratulate all involved. As I'm looking forward to so much to hearing from so many of you this evening. As I'm sure we'll learn from subsequent presentations, this book has not shied away from covering controversial areas in mental health like inequalities, racism, discrimination, both in practice and in graduate school training. And I do hope you'll forgive a short word in relation to these issues, recent events, as regards to the academic publishing industry. I just wanted to read an excerpt from a statement from our CEO, Vicky Williams, at Emerald Publishing. She says, Emerald, we are proud of the work we do on equality, diversity and inclusion. However, we are not proud of the representation of Black people within our business and within our sector. Black voices are underrepresented throughout publishing staff, editorial boards and authorship, as well as the wider research community, and this needs to change. We've got a lot of work to do to try and right the wrongs of centuries of lack of opportunity, representation and support. Emerald must listen, unlearn, learn and act. And she sets out a few specific ways in which we're going to do that, but I've already gone over my 1 minute allocated time, so I won't go into those, but just once again, thank you for giving me the chance to speak to you all. And thank you, Karen, Richard and Theodore, for offering Emerald the chance to publish this crucial new body of work, one which I feel sure will have lasting influence on the field and on future developments. And that was all from me, and I'll hand back to you, Michael and Helen.
Thank you very much.
Thank you, Jen. Thank you. We go on to the co-editors of the book. The book's been edited by Dr. Richard Majors, Karen Carberry, and Dr. Theodore Ransor. And we're really pleased to have both Karen and Dr. Theodore Ransor today to kind of talk to us about the creation of the book, you know, the ideas and concept behind it. So yeah, welcome, Karen and Theodore.
Thank you.
Hey.
Hello there.
Hey everybody, good to see so many people.
Well, I think, you know, honor. Thank you, Jen, for that wonderful acknowledgement of the work. And, you know, it's been a pleasure working with you on obviously behalf of Richard, who isn't here at the moment, but, you know, Richard Majors, Theodore Ransor and myself are the co-editors here, and we couldn't have done it without all three of us, and with Richard leading the charge. So I think that's really important to acknowledge, and of course the amazing authors as well, who have brought such a wonderful breadth of work really here. And I think it's important as well to acknowledge our endorsers of our book as well, who are, I guess, Lord Victor Adebowale, who endorsed our book, and also Dr. Alice Sawyer as well, and the three people who, at the beginning of our book, Professor White, Professor Poussaint, and Eugene Ellis as well. Those contribute some really groundbreaking theoretical models that I think is important to say. So shall I start, Ted?
Sure. Yes, I think it would be lovely if you started. Thank you.
Okay. So I guess I happen to be presenting my chapter, which is a chapter now called Black Therapists, White Families in Aberdeen, with two of my friends and colleagues who are also author in this book as well. And Deborah Gabriel from Black British Academics did a feature on it. And I understand that Dr. Majors asked for an introduction, and we discussed the topic, which included the opportunities given to second generation Black therapists to test their perceptions of their white clients' experience in therapy using categorical variables associated with cross-cultural efficacy, racial identity statuses, socialization and acculturation experiences, and cross-cultural training, and reports of successful outcomes associated with change. That essentially was my chapter. So our conversation widened to the training experience really of Black therapists and psychologists, and assessments and services offered or not offered to people of colour to correctly assess their level of distress. And also we talked about racism, the mental health, and also the criminal justice system. And so we really started to talk about the whole generational aspect of people of colour, Black people of colour, from the school to the jail pipeline, I guess, and the effects on mental health, juxtaposed with exciting theoretical models that were appropriately developed by Black scholars, such as Professor Joseph White, who address the deficit model of psychology and looked at the fact that it was the prominent lens and the model in which the white traditional worldview psychology interpreted and viewed Black people and our culture. And so this deficit model suggested that Black people were deficient, inferior to white people, and with respect to the intelligence, their abilities, family structure, and other factors. And so in a sense, what they were saying was white culture is normal and Black culture is abnormal. And therefore, for white social scientists, different was synonymous with deficient rather than different. And so we were having these conversations and we were saying, you know, it's not based on reliable scientific data, but on racism. And that racism has been allowed to flourish. And so we continue to talk about how that gets then replicated in theory, and that Professor Joseph White rectified this with his article Towards a Black Psychology to challenge the status quo. And what we know about racism and microaggression could fill probably a whole library with lived experiences. And this began to take a global shape through the social media and also narratives. Do you want to add to that, Dr. Ransor?
Wow, I was so involved in that story. I was participating in the session. I wasn't actually thinking about it. I had something to say. Hello, everyone. Thank you so much. I would like to say thank you for everyone who's been participating. I know everyone went through some severe things in the lockdown. I am pleased to announce that my suit still fits. I gained a lot of weight during the lockdown, and I wasn't quite sure, but I put it on and none of my buttons popped out. But if something hits the camera and it cracks, you know what happened. Okay. Anyway, so I'm happy that my suit fits, and I want to say hello to everyone and thank you. Karen definitely put us off on the right foot with regards to the thinking behind it. So I live in the UK, I work at Michigan State University, and Richard Majors was, the gentleman, Richard Majors that Karen talked about, he and I still have a book series with Michigan State University Press. And we're looking for some outstanding press that had a little bit more international connections than what we're used to, and trying to do something that was a little bit bigger than what we've been doing before. So we've done another volume about Black males, and we wanted to really tie into a top-notch publisher. Not that MSU wasn't top-notch, we needed someone that had some more resources. And so Richard went through and found the amazing Emerald Press. So thank you very much for helping us get to where we need to be, and all of the resources that have been made available. For example, the book chapters that are made available that folks can download for a short amount of time. I've never seen a publisher ever give this many free resources to a book launch, so hats off to Emerald. And so our thinking, since Richard has been doing work with Black males in psychology for a while, he's been taking me along the journey, so I've learned a lot about psychology. And we were thinking that right now is the time to do something with regards to Black community health in general around the world, because the diaspora is so self-reflective and it's inclusive of all of our wonderful diversity. And so Richard wound up talking to Karen. She launched everything off and was organizing. So I wanted to talk a little about the process, about the thinking behind that. We wanted to do something big. We wanted to do something that connected to our people, but we wanted to be inclusive to people outside of our circle. So speaking of circle, we talked about this, Karen just talked about Dr. White. I happen to have met Dr. White just about a month and a half before he passed away. And he was actually here in the United States at a conference, sat down with him, had a really good conversation. Dr. White and myself were talking about doing a volume together. He has all of his psychology work. I also do work in fatherhood. We were going to do a fatherhood volume. So when I came back a couple of weeks later, I had the program where he was a guest speaker on my desk. And it turns out my mentor, a guy named Robert Green, he happened to know Dr. White, and he knew him, and that was my mentor. And then Dr. White knew Richard Majors. It was a really nice connection. And shortly after that, he passed away. So I wanted to say thank you to Dr. White for, in some small way, connecting folks within the circle. I'm sure many of you have had some connection with him, but I want to make sure that we lift him up in our prayers and help our prayers push him into heaven a little bit faster than he was going to go normally. And so that's a little bit about the thinking and how we came together. And I'm so happy that we've had so many amazing authors in this volume, but also folks from around the world. I'm going to go through and try and address as many of you as I can in the chat. So bear with me. There's a lot of folks, but I'll be posting as we go along. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And now we're going to hear from Patrick Vernon. Now, Patrick Vernon is somebody who I've gotten to know quite well over the past 3 or 4 months. And I've just, no matter how much I know Patrick, like I just kind of learned that he's involved in more and more and more and more and more and more and more things. But Patrick, 30 years?
Yes, 30 years of Black History Month and 30 years of representation in the mental health system. So I wrote this chapter when we reached about the 35th anniversary of Black History Month in the UK. So I was just doing a retrospective of that.
And so you're looking at Black History Month, and we had 30 years. And so what has been the experience of Black people in the mental health system over those 30 years?
Well, it's actually 32 years. Anyway, that's by the by. Can I read a quote, which is in my chapter? The present state of Black Britain is a grim and unpleasant one, but understanding of the issues coupled with commitments to effect a fundamental change in policy direction on the part of both white institutions and Black organisations could substantially improve the quality of life in Britain and lead to a more integrated and equal society. That quote was written by Aaron Haynes. He used to be chief executive of the CRE. This is a quote from his book, State of Black Britain in 1983. You would think that that probably state was made today under Black Lives Matter in terms of institutions. And in many ways, my chapter reflects the last 30 odd years of, even though there's been a Black presence in Britain since Roman times, we came en masse during the time of Windrush. And for the last 60 years, despite all the research evidence, government reports, lots of people's own lived experiences, we haven't gone that much further in better health outcomes, and we still have issues around the overrepresentation of Black people in the mental health system, and it's getting worse. So I kind of look at it from there's 4 segments to my chapter: why Black mental health matters, and apart from and I kind of look at the turning point in the 80s, from uprisings to riots to the millenniums. That was a critical turning point when a lot of us got stuck in the system, but also there were lots of mental health services that were around during that time period as well. And then I look at one of the key turning points was the 2007 Mental Health Act, with the introduction of community treatment orders, which still has a major impact today. And then finally, I look at the last 10 years from striving to thriving in terms of post the Delivering Race Equality Strategy, which was on the last Labour government in 2009, to where we are now with the over a year, 18 months ago, with the Mental Health Act review done by Sir Fred Westling. And the point I'm trying to make is actually we need to have new definitions, new perspectives, and the UN Decade of African Descent, which is passing us by in Britain big time. We need to, I believe, start adopting new definitions around to explain and articulate the experiences around mental health services. And we should start using Afrophobia, institutionalized racism. But obviously this presents issues which is currently reflected in the whole debate that we're having now around COVID-19 and Black Lives Matter.
Thank you very much, Patrick. The problem with tonight, and I knew before we started that the problem with tonight is going to be, I'm going to want to hear so much from each of the individual authors, and that if I kind of spend as much time as I want, we could probably do a program completely on any one of you. But for now, unfortunately, fortunately, I'm going to hand over to Helen, who's going to introduce the next author.
Yeah, thank you, Michael. But I just wanted to say to Patrick first that I read your chapter, and it was really striking. It was like 30 years of reports, 30 years of strategies, of action plans, equality frameworks, and here we are still, more or less in the same position, really. And then it leads me on to introducing Gail, Dr. Gail Coleman, Oluwabisola, and her chapter is 40 years in the wilderness, and it's a review of the systemic barriers to reducing the over-representation of Black men in the UK psychiatric system. And yeah, you know, I used to work in the NHS, and there was a mental health ward, you know, and all you saw out there every single day was Black males. And I worked there for years and years. So yeah, this, your chapter, Gail, really resonated with me. But anyway, but over to you to talk about your chapter.
Okay, and good evening, everyone, whoever's out there. Yes, so my chapter is about the unrepresentation of Black men in the psychiatric system, and it's called 40 Years in the Wilderness. But if you look back, it's actually much longer than that. And I guess the idea is that we've had this research for so long, and things get, you know, we know what to do, we've had solutions, and things just don't seem to progress in. If it does progress, it's very small steps, if anything, you know, and it's depressing. It's depressing, really. So I am a clinical psychologist, and the research that I write about in this chapter was part of my doctorate research, and it was actually the interviews that I did were towards the end of the 90s, and I started the kind of write-up talking about myself, talking about the fact that I grew up in Manchester, which is northwest England, as a cat, and I grew up in a community where I was raised with the message that I shouldn't trust white people. And the thing that we heard over and over again, that I'm going to have to work twice as hard. And the reason why I started with that at the beginning of the chapter was really two reasons. One was so that the reader has a sense of where I'm coming from. And the second one was just to emphasize that actually this is a very emotional and personal journey. Even though, you know, we can look at statistics and so on. I know working in this field, there's times when I've been absolutely exhausted because it takes so much from me to do the work. What I see in the work is something that I also see reflected in my community, in members of my family, and so forth. So the main finding of the research was back in the end of the 90s, was the existence of a nameless persecutory system. So I was interviewing Black men who were admitted to wards, who often had a diagnosis of schizophrenia, paranoid schizophrenia, and things like that. But when I talked to them, sometimes they were delusional in terms of how it was represented. But actually, when you broke it down, they were talking about a persecutory system, and the conversations that they had talked about racism, and they were talking about a persecutory system in the UK that is a vehicle of control for discrimination, racism, and so forth. And that was represented in their experiences of housing, employment, education, and so on. And actually, the reason why I wanted to do this research was because CBT, which people probably know, cognitive behavioral therapy, it was kind of all the rage back then. And I just thought, but, you know, CBT talks about, you know, we need to change our erroneous thinking. And I thought, well, how are you going to tell somebody that they shouldn't think about racism, that it's, you know, you need to think more positively about it? Even that, when I say it, it makes me feel so angry. And so obviously I've spent time being angry, I've spent time being sad, very sad. I spent time reflecting, and I've persevered and kept on with my career, but it's not been that easy. So as I said, the main finding was this, the presence of a persecutory system, which often was described as nameless. One of the Black men that I interviewed, who were talked about being beaten up in the prison, his quote said, one of his quotes were, "I've experienced some bad things, but who listens anyway? A lot of Black men have died in custody. I thought I could be one of them." And when he said this during the interview, he expressed concern that, you know, I don't want to cause any trouble, you know, I don't want to. But this was in the middle of a kind of delusional presentation. but you could see that it was rooted in very real experiences. And so in the chapter, I go on to cite various research over the last 40 and 50 years. And I link it, you know, when I wrote my doctorate, I talk about the research that was present then, and then I talk about the research that's present now. And as we all know, I think, it's exactly the same themes of coercion, of police being involved in admission, of concerns about over-medication of Black men and women being perceived as dangerous and having basically harsher treatment. And the same thing is replicated in schools. So, you know, I know young people, you know, who talk about being in schools and walking around with their Black friends and being told that they're intimidating when they see their other friends who are walking around in white groups, and that isn't said. So that whole thing of being perceived as dangerous and so forth is across the generations, basically. And so sorry, have I run out of time? Should I keep going?
Thank you. And that kind of that word dangerous kind of leads us on to Michael introducing the next author. Thank you.
Thank you.
You're on mute, Michael.
Yeah, sorry, I'm not mute anymore. So yes, it does. It links us really well to Dr. Sharon Walker, and one of her titles, because actually, Sharon, you have two chapters in the book, don't you?
I do. I've got chapter 1 and chapter 4.
Okay, but the one that links with our last presentation is Big, Black, Mad, and Dangerous.
Absolutely. So essentially, the title comes from a quote, and the last two speakers have talked about the years of inquiries and recommendations in terms of mental health, and nothing's changed. And my chapter looks at the number of Black men that have been killed in forensic settings when they've been restrained. So again, which is very timely in terms of what's happened with George Floyd. My chapter looks specifically at Black men in forensic settings in England. And it was one of the inquiries about 25 years ago that used this phrase, mad, bad, and dangerous, to really explain how people felt about Black men in forensic settings that had mental health issues, because there was almost this fear, and they were dehumanized. Essentially, they were dehumanized. And so the treatment that they got, if, you know, it was assumed that they were being aggressive, you know, they would be over medicated, restrained to the point, you know, of leading to their deaths. So you have this disproportionate number of Black men that have died in these forensic settings, have been killed, I should say, in forensic settings. And over the years, again, it's just countless numbers of recommendations and inquiries, and nothing's changed. We are still where we were 30 years ago, with Black men in these forensic settings being dehumanized. And I think, kind of writing the chapter and doing the background research, what struck me was it's so easy for any Black man to almost fall into that unfortunate trap. And I really struggled, and it was, I think somebody else has mentioned already, the kind of emotional side of this. And I know I really struggled to write these chapters, again, just thinking about the experiences that Black people have endured over all these years, compounding their mental health issues. You know, none of this is going to help anyone with mental health issues. And I was struggling actually to find a way to kind of close that first chapter. And I'm an academic as well, so I was teaching one day, and there was 3 security men that kind of barged into my class as I was teaching and attempted to haul this Black man out of the class, saying that he'd done something during the break. And the whole situation was escalating, and they were threatening to call the police. And literally I could see how, from a simple incident, how things can escalate to the point that somebody is, a Black man is then taken into custody, and because of his size, his demeanor, and the stereotypes around Black men, he can end up within a couple of hours deceased. So that experience that I had with that student, really, so I talk about that at the very end to kind of close it, saying, this is how easy that these situations can arise, and we are still in this situation where nothing's being done.
So they tell themselves stories about us, and then they respond to the stories they tell themselves about us.
Absolutely. That, these huge, dangerous monsters that need 10 people to hold them down. So this is what they do. And, there's, if 10 people are sitting on you and you're being injected, with whatever it is, then there's not many outcomes that can come from that. So I think it's a powerful chapter. I hope people find it a powerful chapter. And as I say, very timely, unfortunately, in terms of what's happening currently. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much for introducing your chapter. Helen, before you introduce the next person, I wonder if you
I just wondered if I could say something quickly about the second chapter, because I'm not coming on again.
If it's very, very quick, because we're already running about 15 minutes late.
Okay. Yeah. So chapter 4, and this is, as I say, I am an academic. I finally did get my PhD. However, the chapter 4 talks about mental health in academia and the struggle. Somebody else has talked about having to work twice as hard. I think it's working 10 times as hard and constantly getting knockbacks, which can erode the person's confidence and, lead to kind of ongoing mental health issues because of this constant struggle as a Black academic to kind of climb through the ivory tower. And I specifically give examples of the PhD journey, as again, there are a disproportionate number of Black students that don't ever complete their PhD and end up feeling sort of depressed and having all sorts of trauma, really, as a result of that. And again, we talked about solutions. So one of the things that I want to do as a result of that is to set up a Black PhD network. So a support group, really, which would be done remotely, so that people from anywhere in the country really can, Zoom in, Teams, whatever it is, and just give support to each other, because it is a very difficult time for a lot of Black people to get through that journey. So thank you.
Thank you very much, Sharon. I know that we need to move on, but I just want to tell you, yesterday, and this was before I looked at your chapter, somebody called us at UBLA talking about exactly this problem of being a PhD student with a white supervisor, and the lack of something that was interrupting the ability of the Black PhD student to kind of reach and to get to where she wanted to.
Absolutely.
So I might actually put her in touch with you. But
please do.
But for right now, I've got to go to Helen, because we've got to go on to the next presenter. Thank you very, very much.
Thank you. Thank you.
Did you still want to ask me that question, Michael?
I wanted to ask you about BME Voices, Helen, and what it was, because you're from an organisation called BME Voices, aren't you?
Yeah, I'm the founder of BME Voices Talk Mental Health. And it's creating platforms for therapists, practitioners and specialists to kind of showcase their work, which is exactly what we're doing today. So it's conferences, events, podcasts, blogs, articles. Yeah, that's what I do.
And so would I just Google BME Voices to kind of get to your website and to find out more about what you do?
Yeah, I'm there. I've got the website. I'm on Instagram, Twitter, all the social media handles as well. Yeah, BME Voices. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Okay, so I'm going to introduce Dr. Nicholas Banks now. And his chapter is the exploration and the motivations behind two Black, I don't know, terrorists. One of them was the shoe bomber from the UK. That was back in, I'm not sure when that was actually, but it was one from the UK, the shoe bomber, Richard Reed, and then one from America, Bledsoe, and he killed people in a military recruitment center. And yeah, it was a really, really interesting chapter looking at the motivations and potential reasons why they did that. So welcome. Hi.
Hi. I too am a clinical psychologist working now in private practice. I noticed Helen's hesitation on the word terrorist, and I think that's for good reason. Particularly if you are a Black person fighting for what you see as a God-given right to freedom, and
can I just say as well,
it will be lost on a lot of people.
Nicholas, can I just say as well that when I was reading the chapter, and I was really kind of thinking about what's the right thing to say about this, because there is such a stigma related to terrorism and, you know, people's perceptions. So yeah, I appreciate that.
Absolutely, because what one person's terrorist is another person's freedom fighter. And it won't be lost on the audience that there are so many Black freedom fighters who have been labeled as terrorists when objectively that couldn't be the case. What I wanted to do with this chapter, I've got 3 chapters in the book, but this is different, and I wanted to do something different and look at really the Black experience of becoming so angry that you could take other people's life and also take your own in that process. And really looked at the issue, the sort of theory of Black identity cross, and also attachment as well. I thought that was, and tried to pull those together as a way of exploring. I did set out to integrate, but I ran out of words, so I couldn't quite do that. But basically what I did is look at models that I thought of radicalizing the Blacks, didn't really cue into the early experiences that people had, the anger that they felt, and the impact on people's mental health, and how looking at these topics through a person's sort of searching for a sense of self could go some way to explaining what essentially anyone who reads the chapter with the people that I've looked at would see as terrorist acts. Whether they were political is questionable. I think that they actually might have been more an expression of rage and anger that was being directed out from these people, that they'd experienced quite a lot of racism. And certainly if you look at Richard Reed, who was the UK case study I used, he had been alienated and from a child going through school as a mixed race individual who didn't make good connections with people, had an absent father who didn't give him a good role model. And interestingly, looking at that, the father showed up as Richard was doing shopping. They met each other and the father directed him towards Islam, but it was a radicalized Islamist Islam that Richard Reed got attracted to, rather than what I would say was true Islam. I would say that my interest in this topic actually came because of watching bin Laden and Al-Qaeda practice and train. When I was in Sudan, I was at the University of Khartoum, and they would practice and train in the field that I could see from my residence. So I was interested in sort of the drivers that might be there. There were a lot of mainly Muslim, what I would say with people who were born Muslim, but in the two case studies that I talked about, these individuals had converted because they saw Islam as giving them a connection and a sense of belonging that they hadn't otherwise got. And I think that's the significance and the link to Black identity that was important for these people. And had they have got that in some more positive way, then the anger resulting in violence that they felt would not have existed. And I think that's probably the importance of some of the organizations that are connected with this, with the book, and also that are listening in, and the support that they give to Black people in looking at how to help manage the anger that a lot of Black men and women experience as a result of racism, and how that can be directed into a more positive stream of action.
Yeah, thank you. And I think for me as well, it was just really interesting that you were using attachment theory and Bowlby to kind of help understand parts of their lives growing up as well.
Yeah.
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 So yeah, thank you for that. And Michael, over to you.
Yeah, I mean, we're going to go over to Ivan now. And Ivan's been doing some work. Are you here, Ivan? Yes, I can see that he's here, but I can also his camera's coming on now. Okay. Hey, how are you, sir?
I'm all right. How you doing?
I'm really good. So you've been doing some work on what you call protective factors for the mental health of young Black boys. They need protective factors.
So the protective factors is the notion that if you look at public health and mental health, we always identify what we call risk factors that young people have. You're a risk for this, you're a risk for that. Protective are just the opposite. So risk looks at deficits, protective looks at assets. What assets do you have that protect you, inoculate you from mental illness? And so that's what that's what I'm looking at. I'm more on what do we need to teach these young men so that they can handle the stress that we know is going to come at them straight from the grave, straight from the cradle till the grave.
Can you tell us something about some of the things we need to teach these young men?
Yeah. Let me just read a statement real quick, because I know I'm a little long-winded, so I just rather just read my comment, and in that way I can answer any questions. So I was also mentored for the last 15 years by Dr. Joseph White. We had a very strong friendship, but one of the things he used to talk about in terms of the challenges young Black men face in our society is if you grow up in certain neighborhoods, he would say, the question is not whether you're going to feel stress, it's how you're going to handle it. So changing the social determinants of health in low-income, underserved communities, with systemic racism being a primary one of them, is going to be a complex and long-term process. My chapter lays out what public health and mental health agencies can do immediately to save young Black men's lives and improve their mental health outcomes. So my chapter focuses on upstream, what we call upstream primary prevention of mental health diagnosis of Black males who are exposed to constant stress and have experienced trauma, both adverse childhood experiences, systemic racism, poverty, youth and community violence. So one of the things that protective factors talks about is that we can prevent or reduce mental health issues among young Black men in the first place by promoting these protective factors in low-income urban communities. It is the most cost-effective way to counter the risk factors and health disparities that keep young Black men in survival mode. Matter of fact, our former Surgeon General, Dr. David Satcher, used to always say, risk factors are not predictive factors because of protective factors. So anyway, using a protective factor framework with Black males can inoculate them against the stressors and trauma. Dr. White used to always say, obviously Black people have resiliency. You can't come out of slavery without having some of these protective factor resiliency skills. That's what protective factor refers to, is how do you come out of constant stress and trauma and not actually show any mental illness disorders. That's what my chapter focuses on. So my chapter first reviews how the social determinants of health, I call them the social determinants of health disparities, have set young Black men up for failure. Failure is built in. Failure is hardwired in low-income Black urban communities in America. So the high levels of sustained poverty, institutional racism, criminalization, including police brutality and incarceration, poor public education, unacceptable housing conditions, and regular traumatic episodes like violence in the home and community create what we call urban America's unique brand of what I call urban trauma. So we've created this phrase called urban trauma, which is unique to low-income urban communities. But the chapter then shifts to, more importantly, why some young Black men are not only surviving in these communities, but are actually thriving. What are the protective factors that they have that are enabling them to live in the exact same neighborhood, but make different choices? Same neighborhood, different outcomes. So what we focus on is what were those protective factors? And then the chapter kind of goes into that. So what we saw based on MEE is my company, Motivational Education Entertainment. We're a behavioral health communications firm, been around for 30 years. So my chapter then explores our primary research and our 3 decades of implementing large scale, I mean, very large scale population health interventions, where we saw at least 15% of young Black people not only surviving, but actually thriving. And that's even within this constant reoccurring stressors and unrelenting trauma that they experience in their communities, right? So we focus on that. And so what we're saying is that we need to take this to scale. So if young people are doing that just organically, what if we actually had a protective factor population health intervention that really made sure kids have these skills to deal with the trauma that we know that they're going to experience? What would be the tipping point if we could go from 15% to 35% to 55% of young people actually thriving and thriving versus just striving? So anyway, I just wanted to kind of focus on that. And just so you know, protective factors isn't a novel idea. This has been around really for a long time. Satcher talked about it. Dr. Carl Bell out of Chicago used to talk about it a lot. Dr. Joseph White. SAMHSA, the substance abuse agency here in America under DHHS, has a whole series of writings on protective factors. But why isn't CDC, why aren't major healthcare philanthropy, why aren't major NGOs implementing this to scale and evaluating it in low-income communities? Because we're not trying to give young people protective factors. We're, based on all the other chapters, we're trying to keep them in this place of what we call survival mode. So that's what we focus on. Let me just tell you real quick what protective factors do. Protective factors can inoculate you from the onslaught of chronic urban trauma. Protective factors help you heal faster if you do experience mental illness disorders. Protective factors also help address not only mental health disparities, but they also deal with all kinds of other chronic diseases and health disparities, particularly in Black communities. So like hypertension, once you feel good about yourself, your health improves, and that's what really protective factors represent. And then the next reason why we need to look at protective factors is because, and I heard this in some of the comments, we're going from a criminalization model in America to a mental health monetization model. So we're saying we're not going to lock them up, but now we're just going to go to just this mental health treatment and not prevention model. So it's another way to monetize poor Black people in America. But that's not going to work because funding is decreasing and you can't treat your way to a solution to chronic urban trauma. I believe that the only viable, cost-effective solution to the social determinants of health in poor urban communities is a population health protective factor of intervention that puts skills directly into the hands of young Black people and enables them to be able to create their own sense of self-efficacy and their own level of self-sufficiency. We also know that low-income Black communities want mental health agencies to go beyond using them for just publishing their findings. They already know, these communities already know the stressors, trauma, and other social determinants are negatively impacting their communities, so they want to focus on solutions. My chapter focuses on solutions. My chapter concludes with why protective factor intervention should be studied and evaluated, and raises the question of why primary preventions like resiliency training are not being funded and evaluated on a large scale in America. And I just will just throw in the UK as well, since we have all our UK friends on the line here. So thanks very much. Really appreciate it. I was invited to participate through Dr. White before he passed, and been glad to meet everyone and get to know folks around the globe dealing with these issues. Thanks, Michael.
Thank you very much, Ivan. Something that's kind of really been kind of running around in my head as I've been listening to you is I've been involved, or I had been involved in kind of youth work and work with young people in the UK for about 30 years. And in the past kind of 5 or 10 years, there's been kind of people throwing money at all sorts of people to do all sorts of things with Black boys, most of which have been making the problem worse and worse and worse and worse. And it is so refreshing to kind of hear that there are people out there that have done thought, there is practice out there, there are things that work, and that why are we not investing in the things that that work? Why are we investing in you know, I sometimes came home from kind of some of the projects I was invited to visit, and I thought if I saw my son talking to one of those workers, I'd kick his ass, because I just wouldn't want my child near most of these people, because they have no shape of their practice. They haven't done the thinking that you're doing, and that the skill is out there. We are there. We need to be putting practitioners together with people like yourselves to kind of start making things work. Anyway, I'm not allowed on my hobby horse too much tonight, so let's get back to Helen and the next presenter. Thank you very much, Ivan.
And so the next presenter, Dr. Tony Talbot, his chapter's about Black Boys Can Project, which is, you know, kind of fits in with what Ivan was just talking about in terms of Black men, and it does start with them from boys. So yeah, welcome, Dr. Talbot, over to you.
Right. Good evening, everyone, and thanks for inviting me. I should say the chapter it's our chapter. It's myself and Sharon Byfield, Dr. Byfield. And in a nutshell, I know time is of the essence, but in a nutshell, we wrote the chapter trying to highlight what the National Black Boys Can programs do for Black boys. And our starting point was the big question: why are Black boys not doing so well in secondary school? Why is it that so many of them are coming out of school with few reasonable educational qualifications? So that was the starting point for what led to the formation of an organization called the National Black Boys Can, which was run and organized by XL3. And so what we try to do with the chapter is to look at that question, and it's been, and I noticed that it's been raised a number of times so far in this evening. Why are the boys underachieving? Why are they being excluded from school? But that's the problem. But what can we do to help? Or what could we do to help? And so that's what our chapter talks about. It looks at some of the strategies that were introduced and employed by the National Black Boys Can program in order to do two main things, which we thought were absolutely crucial. One we needed to raise the aspirations and ambitions of the boys. Now, when you speak to some of these boys, what would you like to be? What would you like to, what's your dream? What's your vision? Some of their visions, their aspirations are actually quite low because they're not seeing people like themselves in the sorts of positions that they think they might want to do. So some of them wouldn't even dream. We've had situations, I've had situations where some of the boys would call and say, do you think I'm good enough to go to Oxford Uni? And I said, well, what do you need to get there? Oh, I need 8 subjects, all A's. And when you look at what some of these boys had, they had more than that. But yet there's this thing, can I do it? And we would be saying to them, of course you can do it. What's the difference between you and any other person in that sense? So we would try to raise their aspirations and their ambitions. We had a number of programs. Some of the programs were about mentoring. So that is it, and that's in two, we could look at that in 2 ways. We not only provided mentors for some of these young people, but we also did mentoring training with them so that the boys could themselves become peer mentors. So this was something that we were doing in schools. So we didn't seek to, we actually tried to work with the schools, mainstream education. We were providing programs for the boys. We were providing programs for teachers. We ran teachers' conferences. I think one of them we ran in conjunction with the National Union of Teachers, for example. So these were national events and they were geared towards raising the aspirations and achievements of boys. We had summer programs, weekend programs, residential programs, programs around study skills. And we would bring in some of some really good people to work with some of these young boys. And what we found, and we had a university program as well, where we took them to Oxford, Cape, some of the top universities where they would spend residential weekends there, so that they could see what the place looks like, meet other students, and some of these students were also Black students, that they could meet and realize that if they have the right support, we think they could achieve a lot. And that's why our chapter focused on targeted interventions, because this is what we were literally talking about some of the practice that the organization was doing. Now, myself and Sharon, we don't come from psychology because we're educationalists, but what we actually sought to do was to look at how, if the well-being and the emotional balance of these boys is intact, their education is also going to benefit. It's a holistic program. It's a holistic approach. And so that's what we try to do in the chapter. So in the end, we had a number of boys and girls, because some of our programs work with girls as well, boys and girls. But what we found was if they stayed on our programs, they not only most of them came through schools, great results. Many of them went on to some of the top universities in the country, which is what we want. And more generally, they can go on to become much more positive citizens. And that was really the main aim of the National Black Boys program. And we've been running for 21 years, still operating, and we're still looking at different ways to continue to work with these young people. So the chapter looks at, it gives obviously a bit more specific examples of some of the programs that we ran, or some of the programs that we continue to run to help these boys. So that was the essence of the chapter. We found that we couldn't just sit back, look at a problem, describe the problem, talk about the problem, and analyze the problem, and not come up with anything by way of solutions. And so we were a solutions-driven organization. We simply said, right, we're going to go into the schools, we're going to work with the teachers, work with the parents, work with the boys, work with their communities, and see if we can make a difference. And that's what the organization's about. And that is what our chapter is about as well. If we can do this, we'll be affecting the well-being, promoting the well-being of these boys.
Yeah, thank you. And just, I think for me, the main important thing that I took out of it, that your project, it's community-led. And
yes,
it's
very
by
much so. It's
the Black community working with the Black boys. Yeah. And yeah, some
very
really
much so.
great work coming out of it.
Yeah.
Thank you, Dr. Talbot.
Okay.
Thank you. Michael, you're on mute.
Sorry, I keep muting myself. There is so much in the chat that I want to share, and I know that we're supposed to have 5 minutes now to share some of the things that are in the chat, but we're already running really late. And so what if we bring some of the chat in later on, and the chat will be available to people, and we'll be able to download it, and we might be able to make it available to people who are watching at another date. But for now, I think we should go to our 5-minute break. And so we'll see everyone back here in 5 minutes' time. Thank you very much. Well, I'm assuming, Helen, that that's our 5 minutes. You're muted, Helen. Oh, here we are.
Yeah, I know. It flew by, didn't it?
I know, it was just kind of, I don't know, time always goes quick when you're having fun. But listen, we're going to next hear from Professor Dawn Edge. And Dawn has been doing some research into kind of African Caribbean mental health in the UK. And she's something she's calling an assets, I can't even say it, Dawn, an assets-based approach. Tell us about it.
Okay, yes. Good evening, everyone. It's fantastic to be here, and thanks to the great speakers who've gone before. Tough acts to follow, but yes, my research I'm going to share with you is about developing an assets-based approach to psychological therapies for people diagnosed with schizophrenia and related psychoses. And I'd like to start really by acknowledging the people who made this possible. So the service users, the carers, community members, health professionals, my fellow academics, the National Institute for Health Research who funded the program, and of course my co-authors, Dr. Amy Degnan and Sonia Rafiq. So Gail started off by talking about 30 years of knowledge about inequalities, when actually the research into race-based disparities in UK mental health care go back over 60 years. And we've known for a very long time that the healthcare of Black people in the UK is suboptimal. So just as an example, and the one that I've chosen to focus on for this presentation, if you're of Caribbean origin, your risk of being diagnosed with schizophrenia is 9 times greater than a white British person in the UK. And if you're a Black African, it's about 6 times greater. And those disparities in the figures actually are played out in the care that people then receive, and in some cases the lack of it. So we have more negative care pathways, so very often involving the mental health system, the criminal justice system. So people end up being sectioned and forcibly detained. Once inside services, we're more likely to receive coercive care, so higher rates of seclusion, control and restraint, more likely to be forcibly injected. Someone's already mentioned deaths in police custody. Well, there are high rates of, comparatively high rates of death of Black people by being forcibly restrained in mental health services also. Not surprisingly, people tend to turn up to services quite late because they're reluctant to engage in services, although there's some evidence that challenges that. But intriguingly then, we go on to be labelled as hard to reach, and rather than being very sensible and staying away from a system that doesn't treat us well. And this to me just seems like such a burning injustice, given that we have an NHS that was founded on the principles of equity. And so I started to work with other people to look at, but what can we do about this? Because this is, to me, is an issue of justice, or rather injustice. So we started organising community mental health conferences in a Black majority church, and really developed community partnered participatory research approaches that fostered meaningful engagement between service users, their families, the community, people who deliver services, people who commission services, policymakers, and so on, to have a conversation about what would make a difference, what can we do about this decades of injustice. And some of the things that people told us that they wanted was to have less reliance on medication. They wanted to have better understanding of how the system works. So what are people's rights under the Mental Health Act, for example? And also they wanted talking treatments, but there was a bit of that stigma affects all communities, but there's some real issues in Black communities about stigma and mental illness. And there was also concerns about the ability of predominantly white therapists to be able to work with Black people, particularly around issues of race. Ended up with us working with people to co-design, co-produce, and evaluate something which we call culturally adapted family intervention, or CAFI for short, an intervention that was developed with Black people, for Black people. And we were able to demonstrate in a feasibility pilot that far from being hard to reach, people were really willing to engage. So we were able to recruit enough families to test out the therapy, and 92% of the families that started therapy completed all of the sessions. And one of the key things that made that possible was having this threaded through people's engagement and their ownership of the therapy. So for example, service users and carers were involved in designing the training that therapists would receive. We had community members who were what we call family support members, who stepped in when a service user wanted the therapy but didn't have their families available to support them to receive the treatment. I'm pleased to say that the pilot trial was so successful that we've now received additional funding from the National Institute for Health Research to conduct a national randomized controlled trial to evaluate the therapy against comparing it with the usual care, and also now to roll it out from what we started, which was just focusing on people of Caribbean origin, because the problem seemed to be greatest there, to now having a therapy that's also going to focus on people of sub-Saharan African origin. And we want to see whether it's cost and clinically effective. Unfortunately, because of COVID, the trials have been deferred to till October, but we're very hopeful that we'll be able to get started then, subject to second spike and all of that. But the message I want to get across really is that we need to counter these narratives about being hard to reach and the deficits model that's been spoken about Black people in relation to mental health care. Because we've been able to demonstrate that when we work with people, when we come alongside and work with people collaboratively for a position of strength and looking at what the community assets are, we can tackle what are apparently insurmountable problems and insurmountable barriers to gaining access to good mental health care for Black people. To do that, I think we need stronger political advocacy. 72 years of an NHS founded on the principles of equal access to healthcare, and yet this is still ongoing. And we have legislation and policy frameworks and all of these things that are supposed to ensure the delivery of equitable, compassionate care. So why is that not happening? Well, in my view, it's time. It's long overdue. And so I'm really inspired by initiatives like, Black Minds Matter, that's come out of what we've seen, the distress and the outpouring of distress following the murder of George Floyd and other things that have been going on. And that's come out of the community. That's Black therapists coming together to offer free therapy to the community. And that for me is inspirational, and it really is in line with the work that we're doing. So if you're interested, want to know more, please get in touch and see how we can work together.
I mean, the idea for me that actually kind of that people talk about this kind of hard to reach thing.
Yeah.
And to be hard to reach is a statement of your mental wellness, not a state of your mental unwellness, because who would want these people to reach them? These people stigmatize, they make problems worse, they don't deal with the thing that we see. And so hard to I think is a statement of our wellness, not of our unwellness in the majority of cases. Thank you very much, Professor, for joining us. Helen, who are we going to hear from next?
Well, actually, just before I introduce the next author, I just thought I'd acknowledge Michael. I mean, we've got, I think it was over 1,400, or was it 1,600 you said today, people that registered for this event. So that's the first thing. But in the actual chat, people have been writing where they're from. And we've got Nigeria, Pittsburgh, Sheffield, Manchester, Texas.
I saw Jamaica a couple of times.
Yeah, Jamaica, Uganda, Canada, New York, Glasgow in Scotland. So I just felt that was important to acknowledge. So hi, everyone around the world.
Our next speaker.
Yeah, so the next speaker, he's across the pond or across the Atlantic, and it's Professor Fabrizio Balcazar, and he's going to be talking about African Americans and the vocational rehabilitation service system in the United States. And basically it's about, you know, being African American, having a physical disability or a mental health issue, and the barriers to overcome to get this support, the VR support. Yeah, so welcome.
Welcome, thank you. Well, I am honored to be one of the first non-Black authors of the book. I am honored. I think this book is very timely, and it speaks a lot about the kinds of things that people need to be studying in more detail and learning about. And I think the timing is wonderful because there is a great mounting interest about the history of discrimination of Black people around the globe, not only here in America. I'm originally from Colombia, but I am, you know, now working at the University of Illinois at Chicago. And over the last few years, I have worked very closely with people of color, both Latinos and African Americans, with all types of disabilities, connected with an agency here in the United States that is called the Vocational Rehabilitation System. In the chapter, which I wrote with one former student of mine, Dr. Judy Breihoff, she and I, you know, went over the history and some critical elements about the discrimination and marginalization of people with disabilities in this country, especially African Americans. And it's very sad, as you have heard from the other authors. The aspect that is critical about this work is that this agency is intended to promote employment among people with disabilities. That was the main reason why this agency was created. And it supports all kinds of things necessary for people with disabilities to get jobs, including vocational training, going to college, getting equipment, all kinds of things. The issue is what is happening with the African American population. Before I go there, I want to give you a little bit of sense about this agency. It was created by law, the Rehab Act of 1973, and basically funded across the whole country, multiple offices that meet people with disabilities, conduct evaluations, they have counselors, and, you know, support these people going into jobs. The problem with the African American population is that many of these agencies don't have the necessary supports or the cultural competence to support these people. Also, a lot of these people are coming from backgrounds that are very challenging in terms of the kind of education, and they have been marginalized in very poor schools, low-income communities, so they have not only disability issues, but a lot of contextual barriers that make very hard for them to attain their goals. The problem with the system was it was created for white middle-class people. That was the bottom line. That's why they created the system. That's who was in their mind when they created the system. So it has challenges the system to address people that don't fit that criteria. We conclude the chapter by sharing some thoughts about some potential recommendations and innovation. The one that we like the most is supportive employment, which has been empirically validated as one of the strongest strategies to help people with mental illness secure successfully and become employed. So we review some of that literature to help the reader connect with some of that, which is very helpful. And then the last part is a connection with my current work, which is focused on promoting self-employment and entrepreneurship. And the reason of that is that we have come across quite a few people that have many challenges in finding regular employment. And self-employment is one alternative that is not often available to people with disabilities. Actually, the vocational rehabilitation system has supports and has money to encourage people to pursue self-employment. The problem is that it takes a lot of work, develop a business plan, those kinds of things, and the counselors don't want to volunteer that information to their people. So they don't encourage people to go that way because it's too much work for them. What we are proposing in our current project is to develop a training curriculum for kids in high school, kids with disabilities. And we are going to pilot this project with kids who are part of a charter school for dropouts here in the city of Chicago. I am a board member in that school for many, many years. And they are low-income kids with disabilities, mostly Black, 70%, and Latino, 30%. So we are going to try to implement the curriculum and help the kids start small businesses. We are also going to provide some funding for starting up the business so they can actually have the experience of running an operation, a small business successfully. So that's why we conclude that, with the combination of the supportive employment model and the self-employment model, we are opening doors for people with disabilities that need that kind of help.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. So let's move straight on then, because we really are running out of time now. So let's move straight to David Trustwell. And David's been doing some work around dementia and its impact on minority ethnic communities. Are you there, David?
Yeah, I'm good. Are we live? Good to go? Fantastic. Okay, my chapter is on dementia, minority migrant communities. I'm just going to make a couple of key points, really, because the chapter itself is quite dense and packed with information. I think my first point is to say nobody really is just living with dementia. Most people who are living with dementia are over 50, which means that they're also living with life-limiting long-term conditions like diabetes or high blood pressure, as well as their dementia. And one of the effects of living with dementia is likely to be that they're quite unreliable in managing their other health conditions, not least because they forget that they've got them. I think that one of the important things to remember is dementia is already complex for people to support and manage because of issues like these comorbidities. And when you layer cultural expectations and cultural ideas about dementia on top of that, when people are, particularly people who are from not basically living in the country that they were born in or identify with, or the culture that they identify with, you have a very complex case. And I think that we underestimate how complex the cases are for everybody from a Black and minority ethnic community when they're trying to manage living with dementia. And I think that it leaves particularly family carers in a very unfortunate position, because people kind of assume, one, that families look after their own if they know how to do it, but that there's some sort of natural ability to deal with this very complex challenge that carers are faced with. What we do need to do, I believe, is have much more effective and appropriate training for particularly Black and minority ethnic carers to actually understand more clearly their support needs, because they're trying to support people with complex number of intersecting issues through a long period of time, and also to recognize that what they need is more respite. They need time off. Professional carers get holidays and leave, and they also get sick leave when they're poorly. Family carers don't. That's something that needs to be addressed urgently. Now, another point that I'm going to make that's central to understanding what's happening with minority communities is dementia isn't affecting all communities in the same way. So, for example, for African Caribbean community in the UK and the African American community in the US, they are both experiencing higher rates of dementia than the white majority communities in both those countries. Also, both of those communities have higher rates of high blood pressure illnesses and also diabetes. So it's not necessarily the case, however, that in either of them or both of them, that what's driving the high rate of dementia is diabetes or high blood pressure alone or in combination. What we heard from some of the Public Health England evidence in relation to coronavirus, for instance, has implied that there may be long-standing socio-economic drivers for the high risk of COVID. Some of the research that's being conducted at the moment seems to indicate there may be similar socioeconomic factors that have a bearing on the high rate of dementia in the Black Caribbean and also African American communities as well. I think we also need to understand for migrant communities across the board that they tend to have much poorer health than the majority community of wherever they're settled in the developed world. But it's not the case that all migrant communities that have similar patterns of health challenges necessarily have similar risks in relation to their dementia risk. It's also apparent that there's a lot of invisible dementia out there somewhere. For example, one of the things I talk about is the Irish community, who we know from health research tends to have poorer access to health services and also poorer access to general high quality health and well-being in their life. You'd expect to see that there's going to be a higher rate of dementia. We actually have no idea because of how poor the ethnicity monitoring is for people with dementia. So we have no idea what's happening in the Irish community, but you ought to see more dementia. The Gypsy and Traveller communities probably got the worst lifetime health of any community in Europe. We have absolutely no idea what the rates of dementia are in the traveller community. So for a lot of communities, in terms of the research and understanding of what's going on, dementia is invisible to researchers. One of the things we need to do is not just look at the ethnicity of people who are developing dementia, but also look at the ethnicity of people who are accessing older people's services. What we also need to do is to try to understand why there are these differential issues across communities, because I think there's a possibility where we can find either whether there are diet and lifestyle issues that actually may be differentially impacting on communities, but also where communities appear to be showing lower rates of dementia. What exactly is going on? What's happening in those communities? What could we learn to actually bring into the wider community to ensure whatever preventative either diet or, again, lifestyle changes, or even if there's some underlying genetic component, what is that and how can that be more generally accessible? So those are the two main things that I wanted to flag out from my particular chapter. There's a lot more about these issues and more in the chapter, and also some ideas about ways of more effectively responding to these challenges. Buy the book. It's cheaper than a new pair of trainers. Come on, guys.
Thank you very much. Back to you, Helen.
Thank you, David. So next we have Patricia Clark and her chapter, Race and Risk, Exploring UK Social Policy and the Development of Modern Mental Health Services. Welcome, Patricia.
Welcome. Hi, can you hear me?
Yep.
It's a privilege to be part of this collective of voices, and I'm watching the chat, which is so active. And the chapter, I won't regurgitate it here, but it was an opportunity to draw on my experiences of many years working within social care. And we can currently see, if you ignore social care, if you ignore the social context, you do that at your peril. We are now seeing how global health and mismanagement and racism costs, and diversity, failing to achieve diversity costs too. We've celebrated 72 years of the NHS, and we've also got a wealth of social care legislation that we need to consider too. So within the chapter, I've considered social policy within its widest sense, in terms of institutions, in terms of laws, in terms of practices, and the language you use to position debate and the impact on lives. Most of my career recently has focused on quality, and that's also in terms of using the Mental Health Act to enable well-being and quality and safety to be considered. So the chapter really was a great opportunity to think about how we can rejuvenate the discourse about safety and quality services to enable a real practical response and improvement to people being seen as dangerous. And language is a really important part of how professionals really work and in terms of achieving diversity. The chapter also reminded me, and I hope that the readers also remember, the real value that the independent sector and faith communities have in terms of supporting well-being of marginalised communities. And at this incredible time now, the independent sector, who have lived experience, who have specialisms, they have contacts, are often out of the argument, and health and social care providers really need to renegotiate a more authentic, genuine, inclusive relationship because of the difficulties now. So I've used practice examples and reflections about poor outcomes, which I believe sometimes are tolerated, and the discourse really does need to shift now in terms of being much more assertive about thinking about safety, thinking about how to balance and balance, you know, carers' needs, include service users, and you know, you can't discuss the NHS without the intrinsic relationship of the Windrush survivors who have played such a key part. You can't, it's so integral. So to end, I think my chapter is largely about relationships and context, a marriage of academics and practitioners, about the relationship between health and social care, and also to offer a practical response for practitioners to think about how to change the lives of the people who need to be treated with dignity and have their well-being prioritised. I do draw attention to the safeguarding obligations. I'm really passionate about the fact that safeguarding, as with regards to adult safeguarding, is a fairly new concept, and it offers such opportunities to shift the discourse from fear to safety. Mm-hmm. So I hope people find it a thought-provoking read, but I hope it does help to rejuvenate the debate. Thank you.
Thanks, Patricia. Thank you. Michael?
Okay, and that we're going to go straight on because I'm trying to make sure that everybody who's here to talk gets to talk tonight. And we're going to hear from Dr. Andrea Rivers, oh no, Dr. Andrea D. Rivers Johnson, and she's going to be talking about implicit provider bias. Dr. Rivers. Perhaps she's not.
I can't see her name up there anymore.
I can't see her name either. So let's just move swiftly on, and then we could perhaps come back to her. And we're going to be hearing again from Karen Cabri with Pastor Jean Gerald Lefleur and Reverend General Jean-Claude about some work that they've been doing, transgenerational work doing in the Dominican Republic.
Okay.
Can I ask Tracy to switch the cameras on, please?
Okay, I've done that.
Okay.
Hello there. Oh, right. So I'm just looking. There's a message from Dr. Andrew Johnson saying she can't see her video actually here. So she is about. So I'll just speak very quickly, and then you can go back to her. So I wanted to talk about the work that we did in Haiti. Now, Pastor Janelle, Jean-Claude, and also Pastor Gerard Lafleur, it's probably about 3 o'clock in the morning in Haiti, in the Dominican Republic. So you'll have to hear from them another time on one of their promos. So very quickly, I went to Haiti for over 7 years to do some work following the 2010 earthquake, and had the opportunity to work in a community with Pastor Lafleur in Jacmel, and to work with transgenerational trauma. And the important thing to talk about is Haiti. We've heard so many things about Haiti from the American president, and don't believe all the things that you hear. It's an absolute beautiful country with beautiful people, and they've got a huge, strong history. If you've got opportunity to watch the video 1804, you will see exactly about that, what these people are made of. Now, the important thing is that there is no National Health Service there. So they're very much about the community looking after themselves. And I think somebody talked about something similar earlier on, and I was hoping to follow Dr. Andrea Johnson, because she talks about developing services. So what we did, we worked with transgenerational communities, so 3 to 5 generations at a time, working together, the community coming in together to look at trauma, to try and explain what trauma is, and also to help people deal and manage conflict as well, and also look at some attachment issues. And what we did was we worked along with the pastors, and all our interventions were couched within Haitian belief system, because it's very important that when you go to somebody's country that you just don't come in and Eurocentrize the therapy. You really need to come alongside. So it was something really quite wonderful in the terms of developing a service where there is no service, without having to find money, well, working with the community. And there is this term, each one teach one, isn't there? So when you have families working with each other to say, we've learned this, let's see if we can help you with the conflict. And then you come back year after year, hearing testimonies about how the families' lives have changed, and how they've managed their distress and the conflicts themselves, and shared that information with other people. So you see communities getting healed. It is absolutely wonderful. And so I'm sure if you have a look at the chapter, you will be as inspired as I am. And I said I was very privileged to then be invited by Pastor Jean-Claude to go to the Dominican Republic to work with the community of families there within his ministry and to do something similar. It was a real privilege, as I said again, to see how we as Black people can, once we've got the tools, can make changes transgeneration. And we don't have to wait 100 years for the next generation. If you've got everybody together at once, you can make instant changes at once. So that's all I've got to say today, and I'll pass it back to you. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. Now, I'm not quite sure where we're going because we had somebody that had a camera problem who wanted to add.
I think she's here now, Michael.
Right.
Andra,
Oh, okay.
she's ready. Yeah. So we have Andra Johnson, Dr. Andra D. Rivers Johnson, implicit provider bias and its implications for Black African American mental health. Hi, Andra.
Hi, everybody. Sorry about that delay. Hello. As you've stated, my name is Dr. Andra D. Rivers Johnson. I am a licensed clinical social worker in the states of Ohio, Wisconsin, and Indiana. I live in Roanoke, Indiana, which is in the Midwest in the United States. I have 36 years, or a little bit more than that, of practice experience as a clinical social worker, among other areas of practice. And I've been in private practice since 1994. I wrote chapter 5, which is implicit provider bias and its implications for Black African American mental health. For the purposes of this discussion, I'm going to use Black, and that does include Black people who are African American in descent. That'll be a little bit easier, I think, as I flow with the information. I talk about provider bias, its effects on access to mental health care, clinical decision-making, interventions, treatment planning, medication management, and ongoing mental health care and needs, including the coordination of care and appropriate referrals. I talk about provider bias as a systemic racism issue. It is, according to the Institute of Medicine in 2003, they say that health disparities are solely racial and ethnic, and not due to access to care issues, clinical decision-making or considerations, or clinical preferences. Also, looking at the social determinants of health, I see that as part of the systemic racism criteria that is used to determine who gets healthcare, what kind of healthcare, how soon you get healthcare, and the quality of healthcare. Marmo, in 2009, argues that healthcare is a basic human right and it's rooted in social justice. So when I thought about writing this chapter on implicit provider bias, I wanted to look at how that serves as an institutional barrier for Black people getting mental health care. The role of provider bias is very crucial to understand and to consider when you look at the mental health gap that Black people face and experience. It affects the mental health disparities that we experience. It also pushes the inequity in mental health care. And for the most part, it does support the research that says provider bias does exist in Black mental health. It's there. And so when I looked at implicit provider bias as a form of institutional racism, looking how it serves as a systemic barrier for Blacks who need mental health screening and care, I looked at it as a way of being a gatekeeper to the system of racism in healthcare in general. And someone mentioned earlier that, you know, we do have health disparities in terms of chronic medical conditions. Like I am diabetic, I have heart disease, I have high blood pressure, so I meet all that criteria for risk factors. And those are areas that I personally have experienced health disparities in as well. And so as an implicit provider bias being a form of institutional racism, I'm looking at how, I'm going to move this now to the American healthcare system. As the gatekeeper to the healthcare system here in the United States, the American healthcare system, you need a referral from a primary care provider or other physician to access mental health screening, care, and follow-up and management. Our system is not like the national health system that you have over in Europe. We have to pay for insurance, some level, even if you get insurance that's part of the Medicaid, or some people call it Obamacare, but it's really the Affordable Care Act that gives you access to get some kind of coverage. In the United States, healthcare is a business. And so you need healthcare insurance to get access to mental health care. The insurance will only allow you limited number of visits or sessions that are covered by your benefit. And in the United States, the more money or wealth that you have, the better health coverage you're going to buy. So provider bias serves as an impediment, as a gatekeeper role that really hits on the disparities in mental health. And it's important to intervene on provider bias and actually eradicate it if it's possible. So my chapter actually looks at how can providers look at their own bias. And when I think of provider bias, in all honesty, I look at non-white providers and the risks that they actually have, but there are Black providers as well all over the world who've been trained in a white paradigm or Eurocentric worldview paradigm, even in our colleges and institutions of higher learning. And we have to remember that those are just training tools, like a toolkit, but we have to tailor this to what we are trying to do when we're working with Black clients who need mental health care. And so my chapter implores providers to really do some self-searching, looking at their own bias toward Black people in general, not the implicit association tests only. That gives you a start, but literally do self-assessment, pre-test, post-test if it's necessary. And there are tools out there to look at their own bias, to also challenge themselves to recognize that they have implicit bias, to look at how unconscious implicit bias is in nature, and it's usually left unchecked. And that's where the problem is. The research affirms that implicit provider bias is very difficult to unlearn because of its historical legacies of slavery, institutional racism, discrimination, prejudicial attitudes, stereotyping of Black people around the world. And my chapter offers some solutions to eradicate provider bias, looking at strategies to reduce it. Providers need skill sets that will include not only cultural competence, cultural proficiency, cultural humility, training, but also how do you really start where the client is? Because that's like the basic of any mental health engagement with your client, therapeutic alliances, and interventions. How do you start where the client is to understand their worldview, their experiences from their lens, and the meaning behind those experiences from their lens, and not put your bias in place because you think Black people should or act or be a certain way. And if we're not the way you think we should be, then there's something wrong with us. Now you're actually labeling us with more disorders. And so I look at different strategies such as trying to understand the link between implicit provider bias and the cultural responses that Black people have to provider bias. So that's not something that we talk about in mental health too often, is how do we look at that link and the cultural responses? We're not sick people. We're actually very strong. We're very resilient all over the world. So how do we tap into that with that client who brings that to the table, no matter what issues that they're working through or they're experiencing or whatever trauma? The research does support evidence-based strategies to help reduce provider bias. And this includes, like I said earlier, the pre-test, post-testing about bias toward Black people, raising their awareness of their own individual patterns of not only microaggressions, but the macroaggressions. What can you not see? And then also looking at ways to practice micro affirmations when you're working with Black people, how to engage with Black communities that's not just in your office or in your program, but literally how do you engage and build therapeutic alliances with all sectors of the Black community? We're not monolithic, but we do have culture that you do need to be aware of if you're going to work with us, to understand where we're coming from and what we need.
Thank you. I'm gonna have to try to hold people to time, because we're now at 20:55 and we've still got a lot of people to hear.
I have one more thing.
If we were physically together, there'd be all sorts of clues I could throw you halfway through your sentence to let you know that you only had 30 seconds. And,
That's fine.
it's impossible to do it with this.
Yes, I
so we are
can.
now going to move to the next speaker. Thank you very, very, very much so.
Okay.
And the next speaker is Maureen Greaves. And Maureen's going to talk to us about spiritual reflexivity. Hello, Maureen.
Hi, good evening. Welcome, everybody. Hope you can hear me okay. But yes, this is such a privilege and honor to talk about my research. So my chapter is towards positioning spiritual reflexivity as a resource, emerging themes and conversations for systemic practice, leadership and supervision within Black mental health. So my experience is I am a consultant systemic psychotherapist and supervisor, in addition to being a leadership coach and founding member of a social enterprise that's been going for almost 12 years. Most of my experience has been within child and adolescent mental health services in the UK, and also supervising other family therapists and also those in independent practice like myself. So the chapter, as I've heard people say before, it's kind of born out of my experience really of starting a doctorate level program and the research that I was doing there. And I quickly realized through going through that process that I wanted to speak about my faith and my spirituality as a Christian woman. And I was being positioned and marginalized and even dismissed through that academic process. So I decided to actually reposition myself and cut all ties with the institution at that time, but continue to write and research and talk about aspects of faith and spirituality. So this chapter is what I consider to be my actual spiritual download from my divine GPS, my God positioning system, excuse me, that helped me to really navigate my way around speaking about something called spiritual reflexivity, which is about spiritual knowing, and it's about including the whole of the person in that consulting room and the discernment that comes from that. And it also talks about how I'm shaped by my faith and how that in turn might shape what I do in my profession, in my writing, and in relationships. So with my faith being so important and spirituality, I just wanted to showcase my faith as opposed to the religious side. So religion for me has been decentered, and the lens is really about my expression of faith and spirituality in what I do in terms of working in the mental health sector. Just want to give you a short excerpt of the poem that I've included in the chapter, and it talks about the diversity of my faith. So faith. Faith is a seed, plant it. Faith is a servant, put it to work. Faith is hope, have it. Faith is blameless, free it. Faith is truth, believe it. Faith dictates time, set it. Faith is a shield, wear it. Faith is your partner, honor it. Faith is a gift, receive it. Faith is understanding, get it. Faith is courageous, stand on it. And faith is God, embrace him. So I kind of look at this through the lens of faith and like I say, as a Christian woman. And for me, it's always about in whatever I do, my profession, in life, for me, it's about God getting the glory within it. There are 3 core themes in the chapter that I write about. And number 1 is about faith, religion, and spirituality as being something really important for Black and minority ethnic people, largely in the form and source of support, whether that is, whether you're a professional, whether you're a service user, or whether you're a member of the community. So it's not excluding or marginalizing one section of the community to another. It's about seeing everything as integral in our culture in terms of faith. And I think that as Black professionals that we often have these or hold these what I call reflexive positions, mutually influencing positions, working for institutions that are oppressive. We may not feel that we've got the permission to talk about our faith in our work because of the caution or the marginalization of any association with religion. But like I said, I do, also decenter religion in terms of the lens that I'm looking through. And, it's not just, being positioned as something we do, say, on a Sunday or Saturday in a mosque or synagogue or church or whatever, or as a set of traditions. I particularly go into that. But I do look at the expression of spirituality in hopefully a transparent way. That will hopefully silence those critics of including faith-based ideas and faith-based ideas in academia and mental health practice.
Maureen, I'm so sorry. I'm going to have to stop.
Oh, have I run out?
Yeah.
I'm sure people are chomping at the bit to go and get the book. So if you haven't already.
People are saying about your poem, your faith poem, and how beautiful it was. Yeah.
Oh, thank you.
Okay, so I'm going to move on to Doreen Robinson and Dr. Renee Singh about forced marriages, honor and shame, Izzat and Sharam, which I found really, really interesting. So yeah, over to you. Welcome.
Okay, good evening, everyone. We had prepared a tiny little video because Rini can't be here this evening, she's not well, but I will just talk, just give a little introduction into our chapter. And it is about forced marriage as a representation of a belief system, which is, sounds a bit wordy, but it's about how honor and shame are integral to our communities. And our work, actually our two vignettes are about two South Asian women. So our own personal backgrounds connect with those women and some of the experiences they had. Now, in our little video, which maybe we'll get to see at another time, we talk about how important it is to think about how to have cultural insider knowledge as well as cultural outsider knowledge. I think the film might be coming up. And how we can position ourselves as clinicians and how we approach belief systems that families have. So we're talking primarily about forced marriage. What is forced marriage? What is coercive marriage? What is arranged marriage? And we go into the complexity of it, because often things like arranged marriage are seen as something that's particular to one culture, possibly the Asian culture. But actually we know it moves across the Caribbean, it moves across Africa as well, and we see it in different cultures. So maybe the film is coming, I'm not sure if it is.
So the idea for this chapter came about from the clinical work I was doing, but also having read a book that my sister sent me by Jasvinder Sangira about about violence, about women being murdered through forced marriage, was the where I started thinking about this topic.
Yes, and I think it really resonated for both of us, Doreen, because we were thinking about our clinical practice at what was then the Asian service, where we worked mostly with South Asian clients, and how the themes of Izzat and Sharam really ran through all our clinical practice and how we could relate to each other from our own lives. And we started discussing how for a lot of our colleagues who didn't come from South Asian or Black minority ethnic backgrounds, these concepts were quite alien, and often they couldn't distinguish a forced marriage from an arranged marriage. And I think that really inspired us to write this chapter together.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think the idea of forced marriage, which is steeped in violence, often I do remember us having trouble having people hear about this topic and wanting to publish this work. And I think it was kind of pushed to, well, it's marital violence, it's cultural It's something that doesn't belong, it's other. But when we stop to think about it, it is the impact of racism.
Yes, and I was thinking how pertinent it is to today's crisis that we're encountering, and thinking about COVID-19 and lockdown, and wondering how it impacts on South Asian couples and whether there's even a higher incidence of violence during this difficult time. So I think, even though we wrote it a while ago, the themes are probably still really relevant to this day and age.
I'd agree, and I think there are always links and connections with other cultures. So I know in the Caribbean community there is this huge sense of shame and of putting out, which we refer to in our chapter, one of the examples of alienation and being put out of the family, being disowned actually, and that's widespread across different cultures.
Yes. So not only is our chapter relevant for this difficult time that we're all living through, but it's also relevant to other cultures and communities.
Yeah. And not just a family violence issue, which is where it's been pushed, but has an impact on everything we're seeing and doing clinically and socially.
We're next going to hear from Dr. Rumana Farouk and Dr. Tanya Rodriguez, who are going to be telling us something about their own leadership journey in mental health. Is that right?
Yeah, that's absolutely right. Hi, everyone. I wanted to start off by saying how pleased I am to have been invited by the editors to contribute to the International Handbook, but also to have co-authored my chapter with my colleague, Dr. Tanya Rodriguez. So I'm Dr. Rumana Farouk. I'm a principal clinical psychologist in the NHS, but I specialise in working with children and young people that have experienced human rights violations. My colleague, Tanya, is a consultant clinical psychologist and works in forensic services. And our chapter focuses on making visible the leadership experiences of Black women of diverse heritage when setting up and delivering a therapeutic service for children and young people and disenfranchised children and young people. And the most interesting point to kind of make here is that young Black girls and young Black boys are disproportionately represented in these services, but yet you are less likely to see Black men and women leading these services or leading the strategic direction of these services. I'm going to give Tanya a chance to share and reflect on some of her thoughts on the chapter with you all today. But I guess the important point to make is that our chapter and also the handbook is extremely relevant at a time when we are talking about racism, social injustice, human rights, and the disparities and inequalities that Black people experience, but also how these processes are enacted when Black women occupy positions of leadership, and how they may experience challenges and opportunities kind of afforded to them in these roles. So for example, when people refer to Black women leaders as aggressive, or in my case, when people often say that I'm unusually assertive. So I guess these are really important points that we consider in our chapter. I wanted to also share with you the words of Bell Hooks, who states that she's fascinated by the fact that white people can talk about and write about the experiences of Black women. And I guess what we do in our chapter is we reclaim our story, our experiences of oppression, and our voice. So essentially, it's our narrative about our leadership experience in our words.
Thank you, Romana. It's been a very, very interesting day. I've been fascinated to hear about everybody else's chapters. And I thought I'm going to try and keep it as short as possible. So I'm going to read my notes to make sure that it's concise. I wanted to give a synopsis, I suppose, of the chapter, but a couple of things that I wanted to just pick up from everything that we've been listening so far is the kind of implicit provider bias that really stuck with me, listening to the presenter talking about it, because it's really some of the things that we've encountered in trying to lead a service that perhaps was set up with the best of intentions, but then failed to deliver because of the systemic biases that we found on a day-to-day basis in trying to deliver the service. So that is really something that stuck with me. So our chapter, which is Marginal Leaders, is a chapter that reflects the journey of 2 Black women leading clinical interventions within a project that aims to tackle child sexual exploitation. And this was in the aftermath of the Rochdale and Rotherham child sexual abuse scandal. This project was developed to meet the emotional psychological needs of those often described as hard to reach. We've spoken about this again. We found this really interesting because actually hard to reach was one of the key words that we used throughout our work to challenge professionals. And we often found them, what was it so hard to reach when they had files and files with information about these young people that we were working with? So what was the part that was hard to reach? And we always got a response that was they were bewildered. They couldn't understand what we were asking. So that was quite an interesting thing. Whilst the opportunity to be part of such an innovative and culturally sensitive project was in itself a privilege, our experiences, on the other hand, highlighted not only the entrenched bias in the clinical and social care practice that indeed contributed to such failings in protecting young people in the first instance, but also it highlighted the systemic bias and denial to accept the need to challenge the status quo. And that was perhaps one of the hardest things for us to do, was to work in an environment where every time we were trying to initiate uncomfortable conversations, we were met with structures that actually prevented those conversations to go very far. This realization then led us to describe what we have referred to in our chapter as pseudo-leadership. Our attempts to introduce Afrocentric practices, social justice, and community psychology was met with much resistance, not only at the grassroots level, but also it clashed with the operational policies and the procedures that underpin the project. So this chapter really highlights the intersection between race and gender, and it feels timely to discuss these topics, given that we are facing significant social turmoil within multicultural Britain in the aftermath of Brexit, in the wake of a pandemic that has yet again demonstrated the impact of social inequalities and how this affects BAME communities, and also in the context of Black Lives Matter. At a time where we have been reminded that no person is an island and that we cannot hide from the realities of another, as there are ripple effects that will eventually catch up with us, and where a time where perhaps we have seen some of the most amazing kinds of acts of kindness. Sorry, I've just lost my track. We are still, as Black women, not being judged, assessed, and promoted on the strength of our own ability, but rather we are being assessed on the basis of our collective limitation. And for us, Black women, the struggle is twice as hard. Not only do we have to work harder to prove ourselves, but once we do prove ourselves and we find ourselves within a position of leadership, we are still limited by the patriarchal and culturally poor systems and narratives and policies that underpin the practices that we are really trying to take forward. So for us, this was quite a personal journey in the sense that we met each other, both coming from very different backgrounds. I just left forensic services, mental health services, to come and work in the community. And it just so happened that we were the only 2 Black women within a team of strategically and operationally, we were the only 2 black women. And every time we tried to talk about community psychology, reflective practice, Afro practices, where we tried to integrate and bring the social graces acronym and the model and try and talk about intergenerational trauma and how our own biases reflect on our practice, how often we were told, well, that's not really what we're trying to achieve here. We don't have, there's no biases. And so it was an interesting journey for us to look at how, even though we were trying to challenge the status quo, the strategic planning and the procedures and the policies that were in place weren't really allowing for those communications to take place to a degree. And so the journey was not a smooth one. I think we've learned a lot from it. what it did do, in fact, was open a much bigger communication and dialogue in terms of working with child sexual exploitation in a country where men from an Asian descent are still being portrayed in the media as the main perpetrators, rather than look at the overall national situation in terms of people, men in prison or perpetrators of sexual violence against young people. So that was an interesting dynamic for us to navigate through. And I'm really looking forward to read the book and to read everybody else's chapters. So thank you very much for having us. It's been a fantastic evening so far.
Thank you both. Okay, so the last author, I must say, I'm really honoured to introduce. I've been a psychotherapist for around 10 years now, and Dr. Aisha Mackenzie Mavinga has had a profound impact on me and my work. So it's an honour to introduce her, and her chapter. It's engaging with racialized process in clinical supervision, political or personal. And she asks the question, are you allowed to be upset about racism, in your supervision session? So yeah, where is she? Hi.
I'm here, yes, hello.
Hi. Welcome. Nice to meet you.
Good evening, and thank you for inviting me this evening. What I talk about in my chapter is not new. It just hasn't been listened to. And as bell hooks, I'm going to quote bell hooks again. As bell hooks said, they don't believe us until we write it down. So now it's a matter of us believing ourselves and getting on with the job. And I've been interested in taking action to evolve therapeutic practice into appropriate practice for us as Black people and people of colour. And I include people of colour when I say Black people. And in doing this work for us to stay alive and survive, so that the field can change, the field of psychotherapy, counselling and therapeutic practice can change. So in my chapter, I just wanted to say that, you know, since the killing of George Floyd and the upsurge of Black Lives Matter, there's been a tsunami of demand for psychotherapy, and particularly from Black people who are now really concerned about their mental health and get psychological support, because I use this term recognition trauma. You know, it's because it's out in the open. People are now recognizing that they've personally been affected by it and they want help. So we need to change our system of therapy in order to provide what I call a Black gaze and appropriate reflection for our people in this, you know, in this phase of Black Lives Matter in particular and forever. So I focus on therapy training courses in the UK that do not specifically place attention on the phenomena of racism and its contribution to anxiety and mental ill health. Individuals have argued that discussing racism would place this oppression in a hierarchical position over and above other important oppressions. A kind of political bartering was applied rather than a willingness to address racism. And this outcry was a form of denial and silenced students in training for therapy practice who wanted to redress the imbalance. And this important concern had been denied adequate reflection in training groups due to fear, naivety, and the guilt of white students and lecturers. Silence and shutdownness seemed to remain on the surface of the educational system. And oppression in the workplace, racism in the education system, and the impact of internalized racism harbored within Black families and individuals continue to take the toll on the psychology of Black people and people of colour, causing physical and psychological illness. The victims and survivors of racism generally address challenges to racism themselves. Consequently, Black people have been the educators of others in this scenario, and that often denies their own learning. And these efforts can exacerbate trauma caused by racism. And often, you know,
Black students question their own mental health because they're not heard and their learning needs are not heard. In opposition to attending to racialized process has been the idea that addressing racism is solely a political stance, imposing on psychological discourse or viewed as educating clients and therefore non-therapeutic. Therefore, it's often deemed inappropriate to explicitly mention racism. Following this stance can create unethical practice, I call it unethical, that denies the opportunity to process racism. Interestingly, this response is not applied when feminist discourse influences psychotherapy. Some therapists fear the consequences of being with clients in a racialized process. The reasons for this can vary depending on personal experience and awareness and supervisory approaches. They may fear the client's rage about the injustice of racism. Often rage in this context is interpreted as madness. Some therapists feel unsupported and silenced due to institutional neglect, and supervisors burying their heads in the sand and remaining silent and inactive, which was my experience. This leads to confusion and hopelessness and perpetuates racism. I've known therapists who do not share their experience of Black clients with their white supervisors, so what gets transferred into supervision and the therapeutic space? I've also known supervisees who work actively with racialized process in client work and supervision. In supervision, therapists can acknowledge their naivety and reflect on where they are with addressing racialized process and the challenge of racism. So I have a book published about the challenge of racism in therapeutic practice. Denial needs to be challenged, rage must be processed, and support to maintain openness about addressing the impact of racism and internalized racism needs to be provided. And this process can include evaluation of history, heritage, institutional racism, cultural heritage, and personal influences. And we need to develop an appropriate gaze, robust enough to cope with racialized process. Culturally empathic facilitation is necessary. Therapists need anti-oppressive supervision that can model ways of explicitly addressing racialized process and holding the trauma and powerful feelings associated with racism. So in the chapter, I've introduced new concepts that are also in my books, and that can be used to create a framework for addressing some of these issues rather than solely relying on Eurocentric approaches. And finally, I leave readers with a question. Are you allowed to be upset about racism in your training, your personal development or therapeutic practice and clinical supervision? Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Michael,
Oh, what an evening. What an evening. What an evening. Helen, I think that we're going to bring Patrick and Karen back on to kind of sum up some of what we've heard. Before we end, thank you really very, very much, Dr. Mackenzie, for being here. Hello, Patrick.
Oh, hi there.
All right.
It's been a fantastic evening.
Wow, hasn't it?
Yeah, it feels like a Eurovision Song Contest.
I think Karen and Theodore, Dr. Theodore Ransel's also going to join us as well.
Now as well. Here's Karen, and Theodore's going to. And so between the three of you, you've got maybe 2 minutes to kind of sum up what has been an amazing evening.
Well, I can do it in probably 30 seconds.
No.
I've written it. So what we've seen, we've drawn on experience of clinicians, academics, clients, stakeholders, practitioners to bring together a comprehensive resource to address the lack of cultural competence in the services used across the life cycle of Black people of colour. We've highlighted racial trauma. We've come with tried and tested solutions that work. And this handbook is a tool of implementation backed with testimonies to address Black mental health and well-being and the recursive transgenerational mental lynching of our seed. It is now time for change, now. If you've had the opportunity, which people have, to read the papers before joining, we should all be on the same page. And our evening of coming together has been like a virtual march. I've thoroughly enjoyed it and been very impressed by all the questions and the presentations. It's been an absolute joy. Over to you, my co-authors.
Go for it, Theodore.
Okay. Well, I wanted to say that for something that doesn't exist, race, I think this volume, more than anything else, highlights how complicated issues of racism and systematic racism is. And for anyone that's interested, buying this book allows you to get bits and pieces for a better overall picture. It's almost like a collage or a puzzle, and it helps put the pieces together in a puzzle. And once you have the pieces put together, you have a complete picture, it's easier to understand. I don't really have much to add. I think there's so much intellectual information. Going to take me a long time to decompress and to process all the information. But I do want to say there's a couple of things in the chats. I am sure that the majority or all of the authors in the volume of the International Handbook of Black Community Health would be delighted to be invited or to participate in any sponsor type of talk or chat or any type of discussion. So please feel free to contact myself or Emma Press with regards to reaching out to any of the authors. I'm sure they would love to have to dialogue with you about next steps. So thank you for allowing me to be a co-editor. And thank you, Michael.
I think I would just add to that, as I said, this book is implementation. It's a tool of implementation. So you've seen a lot of the authors here. There are other authors who you haven't heard. And when you're ready to commission a service and implement it, we are ready.
Thank you. Patrick?
Yes, it's been a fantastic evening. I wrote the last chapter in the book, which is chapter 29, on recommendations based on some of the papers that you've heard tonight. And basically, I'm a campaign and activist, and it's a 10-point plan in terms of change in mental health services, in terms of what the community needs, in terms of how we try and challenge some of the structural issues of structural racism. I think we need to adopt the UN Decade of African Descent and Afrophobia as a new approach around, as a lens around mental health services. Also recognizing that we have different types of trauma in Britain, particularly over the last decade or so. Obviously, COVID-19 is a new impact, a new trauma, post-traumatic trauma. But don't forget the Windrush scandal. There are tens of thousands of people in Britain who have been caught up in a hostile environment for the last decade or so, and they're not getting any proper therapeutic interventions and support whatsoever. And I think this is really, really critical. It's been ignored. I've written letters to the head of NHS England, mental health services, and I've just been fobbed off by saying, wait for the 5-year forward view. The 5-year forward view or the 10-year forward view doesn't cut it when you talk about Black mental health. That's why Black mental health matters. And this is a call for action for all of us online. And we need to demand services that meet our needs because we're paying our taxes and we deserve our human dignity and respect as well.
Thank you, Patrick. And so it's just kind of, I suppose, now for us to end tonight, Helen. One thing that people have been asking in the chat is, will they be able to get a recording of tonight's launch? And if you want to see tonight's launch, if you want to download a recording, all you need to do is to go to the Ubele Initiative, either our Facebook or our YouTube channel, and you'll be able to kind of view and I think probably download it there. I'd like to thank all of everybody that's kind of been involved in today. The amazing way in which Karen has kind of organized this and got people in the right place at the right time, and that all of the speakers were here, and that everything kind of ran so well. Thanks very much for all of the hard work that you did, Karen. Helen, the last words are with you.
No problem. It's just been an absolutely great book launch. Very honoured to have co-hosted it with Michael. And yeah, Karen, you know, BME Voices, I'd love to host a conference on the book. So let's talk at some stage. And I just want to say thank you to Michael and Ubele for actually hosting the book launch for us. So yeah, thank you everyone. It's just been amazing.
Thank you
very much.
And good night.
Wonderful. Good night.
Good night.
Oh, the montage.